we have these two antagonistic principles on earth now that each one of us are struggling with. God's principle of love, greater love is no man that he gives his life for a friend, which means I love you so much I'll do whatever I have to for your health and welfare and beneficence, including, if it comes down to it, give my life that you might live. At war with Satan's principle of survival, the fittest based on fear and insecurity, which says, I love myself so much I'll do whatever I have to promote and protect myself, including, if it comes down to it, kill you that I might live. Give my life that you might live, kill you that I might live. The love versus the fear battle in each of our hearts. As soon as Adam and Eve sinned, they ran and hid because they were afraid. Fear, part of the infection of sin. Perfect love casts out all fear. You see, this is the battle between God's law of love, Satan's principle of fear and self-centeredness. And so in the brain, we have this battle going on between the fear circuits and the love circuits of our brain. The amygdala, fear, alarm, anxiety. This is the amygdala of our brain. And it is analogous to the fire alarm that you might see in a building. A little red thing on the wall, you pull, break the glass, set off the alarm. And when the fire alarm goes off in the brain, it alerts the brain's 911 operator, which is this little yellow part right here called your hypothalamus, which is connected to your pituitary gland. And the job of the 911 operator when the alarm goes off in the building is to call in emergency responders. And the emergency responders in our body come from our adrenal glands, our stress hormones of adrenaline and glucocorticoids. And when the emergency responders arrive at the scene of the fire, there's a fire chief who assesses how big the blaze is, how many responders we have, calls back to the 911 operator and says, hey, you got enough. You don't need to send anymore. In our brain, hippocampal neurons have stress hormone receptors, glucocorticoid receptors, that register this rise, signal back to the hypothalamus, say, you got enough. You don't need to send anymore. How this works in your life. You're walking along this weekend with your family. Well, maybe not this weekend. We'll put it into the spring when it's a little warmer. Walking along in the spring with your family in the park, and you step forward in the grass, and out of the corner of your eye, you see something black and slithery down at your feet. What are you likely to do? Your alarm's going to fire. Call in emergency responders. Your heart rate's going to pick up. Your blood pressure's going to pick up. Your respirations are going to pick up. Blood is going to shunt out of your guts into your muscles so you can run out of there as fast as you can. You might be 2 or 3 steps away already before the prefrontal cortex, right here where you do your thinking, catches up and goes, it's just a rubber hose. Haven't you had something like this happen? Now this is critically important. As soon as the prefrontal cortex says it's just a rubber hose, what happens inside of you? Does the alarm turn off and everything start calming down? Part of the job of the prefrontal cortex is to process this stuff coming out of this, what we call the limbic system, this emotional center down here, and when appropriate, turn that system off, calm it down. One of the problems that many people have in life, most of the patients I see in my office have this trouble, is there's a dysregulation. This is what sin has done. It's dysregulated our normal balance that God has designed. These fear centers are way out of control, and we have lost the ability to govern ourselves well. I'll tell you, I'll probably come back to this again, but I'll mention it right now. In between the prefrontal cortex where you do your thinking, reasoning, planning, and the emotion centers is the anterior cingulate cortex. And the anterior cingulate cortex is where we have the will, your power of choice. When you say, I choose to do this and I choose to do that, you're exercising your will. Not only that, the anterior cingulate cortex is where we experience empathy, compassion, other-centered altruistic love, caring for another person more than ourselves. Now what's interesting is that when the anterior cingulate cortex is active in a loving, other-centered way, it is wired into our alarm in such a way that it turns the alarm off. So the more you have other-centered love and activity here, the less fear you have. Neurobiologically, they're like a seesaw. When this activates, it's hard to keep the anterior cingulate cortex active. This is why people in great panic and fear often don't think very clearly, and they aren't very gracious. You know, this is why people get stampeded at a theater when there's a fire. They don't think clearly, and they aren't very loving to let some little old lady go before them out the door. They just run right over it. Boom. Okay? Because fear is in control. Okay. Now these two areas of our brain, actually the Bible talks about. It says in John 8:32, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. This is where we have truth, prefrontal cortex. But the Bible says in James that we are dragged away and enticed by our own evil desires. They come out of this part of our brain. Now, what happens when we have unhealthy thought or belief systems? Remember I told you earlier, beliefs affect us and change us. If you believe things like this, everybody thinks I'm stupid. People think I'm fat. Nobody likes me. Nobody will ever love me. I'm too ugly to be loved. These types of thoughts. What do you think happens in your mood centers? When you come around people, when somebody walks in the room, maybe you think a particular guy or girl is cute, but you have these beliefs about yourself. I'm ugly, I'm stupid, I'm no good. When that person comes around, do you think you feel at peace and relaxed? Or do you think you feel very tense and stressed? The alarm centers fire because we have these lies in our head. Lies are what damage us, these unhealthy belief systems we have. This is why truth heals and truth sets free. So, why does sex hurt us emotionally? And understanding, I want you to understand those fear circuits, love circuits, because we understand why does sex hurt us emotionally before marriage? Do you change emotionally after having sex for the first time? Well, first, and there's going to be two parts to this answer on the emotion. First part is the fear circuits that we're going to talk about. Premarital sex, limbic system. During premarital sex, or adulterous relationships, it is a process in which the emotion centers are overruling good judgment. And when emotional centers overrule good judgment, our conscience, out of our prefrontal cortex, our judgment, our reason, convicts us. I shouldn't have done that. What was I thinking? We then begin to lie and deceive. Lie to our friends, lie to our parents, lie to our siblings, which causes more conviction of guilt and fear. You see, when we do wrong, then this fires the fear circuits. Now let's talk about what firing fear circuits do to us as far as ability to grow and develop. Fear is the medium of death, I'll just tell you. Love is the medium of life. When the fear circuits of the brain fire, physiologically, they shunt blood out of your guts into your muscles so you can fight or flight. But if the blood is out of your guts, can you absorb nutrients? And in fact, if you've just eaten a very heavy meal and you've been seriously frightened, what's likely to happen? You're going to vomit the meal up because all the blood is shunting away and the body wants to get rid of it. You really can't grow well physically if you're in constant state of fear. What about cognitively, scholastically? Ever heard of test anxiety? Or maybe stage fright. Somebody comes up here at church and they know exactly what they're going to say. They get up there and they walk up and they get in front of the mic and they freeze. What happened? Fear circuits fire and they paralyze the prefrontal cortex. So we can't think clearly. So we don't reason well. We don't understand. We don't process when we're in fear. So we don't grow intellectually. Think about relationships. Think about how other-centered you are when you're in moments of desperate fear. How kind you are when you're in moments of desperate fear. Fear paralyzes our relational growth. And what about spiritual growth? Do you think we grow close to God when we're terrified of Him? Fear is the medium of death. Love is the medium of life. And it's just the opposite, which allows this type of growth on every level. Okay, so with that in mind, premarital sex, what happens in our mind? What happens in our brain? What happens to these circuitries when we're having premarital sex? Well, first, our prefrontal cortex convicts us. We get a sense of guilt. We get a sense of fear. We worry. We lie. All this kind of stuff happens. And how do we resolve the guilt? Well, there are only two ways to resolve guilt. And guilt is a very destructive emotion. It fires the amygdala. And I don't think I mentioned this, but I'll just go tell you. If the amygdala never turns off, if the fear center never winds down, even though we had our fire chief holding our 911 operator in check, if the amygdala keeps firing, that stress hormone, it will activate peripherally in your body your macrophages, your white blood cells. And your macrophages begin releasing toxic little terrorists, inflammatory factors called cytokines. And these cytokines do terrible things to our body. They damage insulin receptors in our body. They cause neurotransmission problems so that if I were to take just a syringe full of cytokines and inject into you, within a few hours you would be experiencing terrible aches and pains all over your body, appetite disturbance, sleep disturbance, concentration impairments, and extreme fatigue and malaise. These are what these inflammatory factors do. Now, these inflammatory factors then cross into the blood-brain barrier and cause a cascade of inflammation in the brain, which begin damaging the white cells of our brain which support the neurons, and ultimately suppress genes in our brain that keep our brain healthy and lead to depression. This is what happens when this cascade of stress doesn't turn off. The stress diathesis leads to all this physical health problems and mental health problems. So how do we resolve guilt? We want to resolve guilt because guilt keeps that amygdala turned on. Well, we have God's way. Repentance and, if possible, restoration. Experiencing, through God's grace, a new heart and a right spirit, and then the guilt is resolved and we can move on in peace because we've been changed and we've experienced reconciliation. But there is another way to avoid the guilt. And that way is denial and distortion. It wasn't me. It was the woman you gave me. She wouldn't have brought me that fruit. I wouldn't have done anything. I'm okay. She's the one with the problem. Denial and distortion. But denial and distortion damages the mind. You've ever heard that statement? He's bending the truth. She's twisting the truth. You've heard that? Truth can't be bent or twisted. Truth is truth. So imagine a telephone pole we're looking at, and I hold a lens up between you and the pole, and now you look at the pole through the lens, the pole appears bent. Have we bent the pole? Pole's still straight. We've only bent our view of the pole. This is what people do to avoid guilt. They have to bend their view of the world, and they have to put this lens on their mind. And it's not just on this one issue. Once the lens, once this warp, once this distorted lie they've got in their mind is there, they take it with them everywhere. And if you've ever met people like this, think about this. You're looking at the telephone pole without a lens. They're looking at the pole through the lens, but they don't know they're wearing a lens. Will you ever convince them the pole's straight? Have you talked to people like this? They just don't seem reasonable. The evidence doesn't seem to have any. They twist everything you say. Yeah, they've got warped minds because they're avoiding something. They're avoiding something in their life that will bring conviction and guilt. And the only way to unwarp the mind is by the truth. As we bring truth back into the mind, it unwarps and takes this lens away. So, how are we changed with premarital sex? With this type of guilt, leading to denial and distortion and all these other things that damages us. Now, even more interesting is a brain hormone called oxytocin.